Hello BookTube. The show Heated Rivalry is about to make its UK debut as I'm filming this, and so I have spent the last couple of weeks in a Game Changers themed reading hole. I have pretty much binged the entire book series ahead of the UK release of Heated Rivalry. I wanted to know what the hype was about. I've been aware of the books for a long time. I never really thought that sports romance would be my thing, but then in the last year I've had both You Should Be So Lucky and The Prospects change my mind on that. And when the show blew up and I found out that it was going to come to the UK, I thought, why not jump on the bandwagon and see what the hype is all about. So I have read every single book in the Game Changer series ahead of the release of Heated Rivalry in the UK, and I'm going to rank them for you today. I have given this quite a lot of thought over the last couple of weeks, and I do think that there is a significant shift within the series in terms of quality. Some of the books were a little bit disappointing and others were really pleasantly surprising. I could talk about these books for a long time, so without further ado, we're going to just jump into my official ranking. The lemon post-it notes have no thematic relevance to the video. I just happened to have post-it notes that were in the shape of lemons. Why? I don't know, that's the kind of whimsical bitch I am, I guess. But I have ranked every single book in the series, all 6 books. It took me a while to come up with the kind of middle of this. The bottom book and the top couple of books were very, very easy for me, but this kind of middle area was where I really needed to do my thinking and my reflecting before I came to you with this video. Having given this a lot of thought, this is a ranking that I feel pretty comfortable with. I'm pretty happy with this, and I would say this is pretty reflective of my enjoyment of the reading experience of the series as a whole. In number 6, we have Game Changer, which is the first book in the whole series. This book kicks off the series. We follow Scott Hunter, who is a hockey player. All of the books focus on characters in the NHL in the States and in Canada. In this book, we follow Scott Hunter, who is a player for the New York Admirals, I want to say, and we follow his romance as he has this kind of meet cute with a guy in a smoothie store, and it goes from there. At the start of this series and at the beginning of this book, no players are openly out as queer in the NHL, and Scott has been closeted for his whole life. I think he's about 30 in the start of the book. He has been grappling with his queer identity for his entire NHL career, really, having the occasional hookup in secret, but really struggling to date anybody. And he meets Kip, who works in this smoothie store. They develop a relationship, and it kind of makes Scott question everything about whether he can continue to kind of live this secret life, I suppose. And so I found Game Changer to be a book of kind of 3 parts. The first part of the book was pretty cute. It was like a standard meet cute. It was very sweet. It was really nice to see Scott kind of bring down these walls that he's built up around his sort of queer identity and the walls that he has up whenever he's engaging in like a relationship with another man. Those all kind of start to come down as he meets Kip, and it's all very cute and sweet. The middle of the book I struggled with. It's a little bit predictable and it was a little bit repetitive in the kind of conflict between Scott and Kip and what is preventing the relationship from developing further, and there was a kind of use of the miscommunication trope that I wasn't really into. And then the ending of Game Changer is phenomenal. It is incredibly emotional, and it's kind of a catalyst that sets up the rest of the books in the series. So Game Changer is very important to the overall series, I would say, and the ending definitely makes it worthwhile to read, but it's not a standout in the series overall as a whole. I would say it's worthwhile reading Game Changer. I would recommend reading the whole series in order, if I'm honest. I know some people just read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game because they're big into the Shane and Ilya storyline, but I would say these books are all very intertwined with one another, and it's definitely worth reading them in order. The ending of Game Changer, for me, made the build up to the ending of Heated Rivalry more enjoyable because I knew what was coming. The books kind of flip back and forth in time as you're following different men throughout their NHL careers and the effects of events in other books on those characters. So they're kind of all happening largely simultaneously, I would say. I do think the ending of Game Changer was really powerful. I really enjoyed it, and it did set me up with an expectation for what was going to come down the line that made the reading and experience of the later books a bit more enjoyable. From a writing standpoint, I have Game Changer in number 6. It very much reads like the first book in the series. Rachel Reid is kind of finding her feet with her writing style a little bit, and I think this one is one of the more basic entries in terms of the writing style, but I still enjoyed. In at number 5, this is probably going to be a controversial take, but we have Heated Rivalry. Don't come for me. I love Shane and Ilya as much as the next person. I think the romance at the core of Heated Rivalry is probably the most interesting, or one of the most interesting romances throughout the series. However, there are a couple of things about Heated Rivalry that meant that I couldn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. For context, for anyone who isn't familiar, Shane and Ilya are players on rival teams. Obviously, all of the teams are rival teams, but in particular, their two teams have this long-standing, very built-up public rivalry. And as they both end up becoming captains of their teams, their particular rivalry is really beefed up in the public eye, and they are painted as like these two guys that absolutely hate each other's guts. But little do people know, behind the scenes, Shane and Ilya have been hooking up in secret since before their rookie season. And therein lies one of my problems with Heated Rivalry. When they first start to become interested in each other and get together, they have both recently turned 18, and it really gave me the ick to be reading intimate scenes between two 18-year-old boys. The fact that these two have been in a kind of secret hookup relationship for so long, it really does add to the emotional depth of the story. I wish maybe we hadn't focused so heavily on the spicier scenes when Shane and Ilya were so young, and we could have saved that for later on in the book. There's also a lot of fucking. I think more than any other book in the series, like these two are at it all the time, to the point where it became incredibly repetitive. And I felt like we could have maybe skipped a few of those scenes, especially earlier on in the book when they're both young, to build up some more of their character arc. Heated Rivalry struggles, I think, in the fact that there are very few sort of side characters that are really well developed in this story. In later books in the series, the side characters add a really great dimension to the other books and to the characters at the core of the relationships. But in Heated Rivalry, you're focusing very much on Shane and Ilya as individual people, and I felt like the book struggled with that. I think it would have been better to get to have more of a sense of who these two were separately, and then them coming together and forming this relationship would have been more impactful. But I did still enjoy both of these two as characters in the book. I just wanted to see more of them. I wanted to see more, especially Shane. To me, it reads very obvious that Ilya is Rachel Reid's favourite character. And I'll touch on this later on as we go through the rest of the books. But I do feel like Shane maybe doesn't get as much. He doesn't get as much on-page time or as much development as I feel like Ilya does. And that could be because Ilya comes with a bit more baggage. Ilya's got some like messed up family stuff going on, whereas Shane has a very kind of normie family relationship. There is a relationship that Shane has later on with a woman in the series that I really enjoyed, and I would have liked to see that be developed a bit more. So yeah, I do feel like Heated Rivalry, I enjoyed it, I enjoy the relationship, but I do actually feel like I'm maybe going to enjoy the show more than I enjoyed the book, because of all of the aforementioned issues that I had with it. Then coming in 4th place, we have The Long Game. This is the final book in the series and a return to the relationship between Shane and Ilya. The next book, so these are books 3 to 5. This is book 6, and we return from Heated Rivalry to Shane and Ilya and see how they are faring after the events of Heated Rivalry, basically. And The Long Game suffered with a lot of the same issues as Heated Rivalry did. There was too much smut, again, and the writing kind of improved, I felt, in the middle books, and then in The Long Game we kind of returned to this simplistic writing style that we had in Game Changer and Heated Rivalry. For me, I think a part of that is, as I said, Ilya appears a lot in the other books as a side character. A lot of characters will play on the same team as him, or they get traded to the same team as him, or they will run into him in social situations when he's in like New York, like he sees Scott Hunter quite a bit. And Ilya's characterization is he's this kind of annoying, funny, gets under your skin Russian character. But he also has this other side to him where he's very perceptive and he's very aware of what's going on around him, and he often clocks a lot of the other queer characters for their romantic feelings before even maybe they've admitted it to themselves fully. Ilya probably has the most honed gaydar of any man of all time. In the other books, a lot of the characters will interact with Ilya as a side character. This, I think, both improves the writing in these later books because a lot of these characters have great moments of dialogue with Ilya where they kind of open up, they get a bit emotional, they maybe have realizations about themselves, and it propels the story on in a way that feels a lot more natural and organic. Ilya doesn't have that with anyone because he is Ilya, and there isn't anyone around him that is really doing the same emotional work in the story that Ilya is doing for a lot of these other characters. And so when it comes to exploring the emotional lives of Shane and Ilya, Rachel Reed can't rely on Ilya the way she does in these other books. So it reverts back to this very early days telling and not showing kind of writing style, which is very basic, where we're like, Ilya feels this, he thinks this happened, and he feels this way about it. And it gets very, very basic and repetitive, which is a shame because I think this is probably one of the more interesting relationship dynamics because of the whole secrecy over a long period of time thing. That's why people sometimes just read these two books, because it has arguably the more dramatic relationship dynamic. I did enjoy in the long game seeing how Shane and Ilya's relationship is developing. I enjoyed where we left off on Heated Rivalry. The end of Heated Rivalry is very emotional, largely because it coincides with what kind of happens at the end of Game Changers, and the end of Game Changer really impacts the end of Heated Rivalry. And so I was very interested to see where we went in the long game because of how this ended. I do feel like Shane really suffered in this. Shane did not get anywhere near as much developmental time as Ilya did. Ilya has a lot more going on. I really wish we could have seen more of Shane's relationship with his team. Like I said, we see Ilya a lot, and we see a lot of his teammates a lot, or a lot of people who end up playing on the same team as Ilya. With Shane, we barely get any development of his teammates apart from one or two, and they're, again, very minimally represented. Whereas with Ilya, we have a lot of characters that we've met in these other books and grown quite fond of, and they reappear in the long game. For Shane, we don't have that. And so the impact of what happens in the book for him, the reaction of his teammates and things like that as things develop in the story, it fell a bit flat for me because we didn't get to the emotional work put in to build up Shane's relationship with that team in the book. So that disappointed me a little bit. And the ending of the long game, I have to say, was very similar to Heated Rivalry. It felt like it followed a similar kind of beat in terms of the plot points and the twist that happened at the end or whatever. Very similar to Heated Rivalry. I would have enjoyed getting to see Shane and Ilya have a little bit more agency in how they pursue their relationship in the public eye. And so for that reason, I found the long game, I honestly went into this one thinking it was going to be the best one in the series because people hype up the long game so much and people love Shane and Ilya. I was quite disappointed in this entry. It really didn't live up to the hype for me, and there was a lot in it that I didn't think was as strong as I was expecting it to be, especially seeing Rachel Reed's writing style and characterization develop so much in these other books. So that was a bit of a bummer for me. But I still do love the relationship between Shane and Ilya, and I think that it's going to be, I think it could be one that translates better to screen. And so I do think that I'm probably going to enjoy the show a little bit more than I enjoyed the actual books themselves. I know there's still going to be a hell of a lot of smut in the show. I'm aware, I've seen the memes. But I do feel like maybe we'll get a little bit more development of some of those other themes, because with the show you can't rely just on the smut to carry you forward. Whereas I do feel like Rachel Reed occasionally in these two books does rely on you being attracted to the main characters and finding them hot and finding their dynamic hot to propel you forward through the story. So we will see. What I think is going to be another controversial take, my third place pick is Common Goal. Now, this is probably a bit of a controversial choice because I've seen a lot of people complain about Common Goal being very basic and very kind of standard romantic novel fare. And I can agree with those criticisms. Common Goal focuses on Eric Bennett, who is a character we very briefly meet in Game Changer. He's on the same team as Scott Hunter, and he is quite a bit older than the other players. He's 40, turns 41 over the course of the novel, and he is secretly considering retirement. What I found interesting about Eric's dynamic that propelled the story forward for me and made me enjoy it a bit more than the other three we've spoken about so far is the fact that Eric Bennett has been married to a woman for most of his adult life, and then he gets a divorce. And Eric, throughout all this time, has always known that he was bisexual. But because he has been married to a woman and he hasn't been able to explore that aspect of his sexuality and his attraction to men, he has kept it to himself, and he is kind of struggling mentally and emotionally with accepting the validity of his bisexuality because he's never been with a man, even though he has known that he is bisexual and he's known he's held this attraction for a long time. And I really enjoyed that as a later life coming out story rather than some of these later life stories we get where it feels like a little bit of a rehash of the gay for you kind of trope. You get a character who is always identified as straight until later in life they meet one person and bam, suddenly they're bi or they were gay all along. Eric has known that he was bi all along, but he's just never been in a position to be open about that or to explore that and what that means for himself. And he struggles to be able to label himself as such, given that he has no experience with men. And this is something that I've struggled with as a bisexual person, something I know other people in my life have struggled with, something that people have had leveled against them as bisexual people. Like, how can you know that you're bisexual if you've only been with XYZ gender? And I think it was nice to see a character have that internal struggle. It wasn't handled as carefully as I maybe would have enjoyed it to be. It would have been nice to have Eric maybe come to the realization that he can be open about his sexuality and not have to be with a man to validate those feelings. It was still cool to see. It was still cool to see a bisexual character who's known they're bisexual for a long time and to have a sort of more later life coming out story that was a little bit maybe different from what I've read in the past. And so we have Eric, who is kind of been divorced for about a year, and now he's like, I'm in a position now where I feel ready to try and date men. And he has the hots for a much younger bartender who is a character we actually meet in Game Changer, and I felt like he was done dirty in Game Changer. I feel like Kyle was made out to be a little bit of a villain in Game Changer, a little bit. It was nice to see some justice being done for Kyle's character in Common Goal, because I think that, like, Rachel Reed did him dirty in Game Changer. So yeah, justice for Kyle. Kyle is friends with Kip, who's the love interest of Scott Hunter in the first book. We get a lot more exploration of the side characters that we were introduced to in Game Changer. In Common Goal, there's a side character called Maria, who I really enjoy. She's a lot of like comedic relief, and she and Kyle are very close, and I enjoyed their banter. This one was one of the funnier books for me. I was like actively laughing out loud at some of the points and some of the banter in the book. They kind of agreed to do a friends with benefits thing so that Eric can get more confident with dating men and being with men, and it's a very formulaic story, and the end was pretty disappointing in this one. It's a very, very rushed ending. I think Rachel Reed could have taken her time to develop the ending and make it more satisfying for us as the reader. But ultimately, I just have such a soft spot for Eric. He's one of the more nuanced, I would say, hockey players in this kind of universe. He's quite different from the other people that we meet in the story. He's Harvard educated, he's a big reader, he's into like yoga and art, and he's a little bit different from the other guys that we get to meet, and so that made me a little bit more interested in the story. He is the only other bisexual protagonist. Ilya is bisexual. I think I forgot to mention that before. So we have Ilya, who's bisexual, and Eric, who's bisexual, and all of the other characters are gay. So I like seeing bisexual rap, especially bisexual men who get so erased in a lot of discourse and in a lot of media. So it was nice to see another bisexual protagonist. It was nice to see some of the internal struggles that bisexual people go through being reflected on page. And so for that reason, Common Goal is my number 3. It's not anything groundbreaking. The story is pretty formulaic, as I've said. It's a standard friends with benefits to lovers story, but I had a good time with Common Goal. In second place, we have Tough Guy, which is the 3rd book in the series. So this one follows Heated Rivalry. And we are following a character we meet in Heated Rivalry called Ryan Price, who is an enforcer on the ice. He's a big guy, he's like 6'7", he's built like a brick shithouse, and he is basically, throughout his whole career, his value to his team is to be the one who is protecting the more valuable, more talented hockey players through violence. He's the one who has to get in fights on the ice to protect the other players. And Paul Ryan is actually just a massive softie with an anxiety disorder, a chronic fear of flying, and he hates fighting, and he hates being this kind of beacon of violence on the ice, and he hates the fact that people want that violence out of him, and that is what he's known for. He really, really struggles with that identity. It was interesting to see a character who, all of these other guys love hockey. Hockey is their life. Hockey is their passion. It is the thing that gets them through like all of their struggles in life. It's like their one big purpose. Whereas for Ryan, it's kind of just like something he got into, and now he can't really see a path out of it, even though he knows that hockey is ultimately making him quite miserable. He gets traded a lot, and at the beginning of Tough Guy, he gets traded to Toronto, where he happens to reconcile with Fabian Sala, who is a musician that he lodged with when he was like a rookie coming up in the hockey leagues or whatever. He moved in with Fabian's family, and they both had big crushes on each other, didn't realise it, and there's one night that kind of happened between them where there was like a will they, won't they, where they almost kissed, didn't, and now 13 years later they happen to meet up again in Toronto, and they rekindle that friendship, and the romance goes from there. This one is so lovely in its exploration of mental health, in its exploration of different representations of queerness, like different ways that queer people present to the world. Like Fabian is incredibly femme and is described as like angelic and beautiful and is really captivating on stage. And then you've got Ryan, who is this like giant of a man, and he kind of struggles to articulate the fact that he is attracted to more femme-presenting guys like Fabian. He struggles with the requirement of him on the ice to be violent. He doesn't want to fight other people. He struggles to build relationships with his fellow players, and he's often very marginalized. Like he's like completely pushed out. People think he's a bit of a weirdo because he's like so scared of flying. The side characters in this really make it as well, I think. Like Ryan develops a really lovely relationship with another player on that team called Wyatt Hayes, who is fantastic. Love Hazy. Whenever he's on page, I always have a great time reading about him. And then Fabian has a really wonderful friend group as well. And I liked this contrast from Game Changer, where we have Kip's group of friends, but they're very like one note and they're not very well developed, whereas in Tough Guy, the relationships between Ryan and Wyatt, and then Fabian and his group of friends, and then how this group of friends kind of brings Ryan into the fold and helps him to explore more of his queerness, is just really lovely. A lot better executed than in the other books in the series. Like Game Changer has it but doesn't really utilize it, and then with Heated Rivalry in the long game, that it does just kind of like completely, like side characters are pretty much thrown by the wayside for the most part, with the exception of maybe like Rose Landry and one or two others maybe. Tough Guy, actually, like, this is where we see Rachel Reed delving into some more heavy-hitting topics. The long game does deal with mental health, and Ilya is struggling with his mental health a lot in the long game, and I enjoyed reading about that, but I think she pulls it off a lot more successfully in Tough Guy. It's a lot more nuanced. The dynamic between these two is really wonderful. You really see Fabian, who is super visibly queer and comfortable in his queerness, helping Ryan to break down those barriers and overcome his anxiety, and they really do like bring out the best in each other in Tough Guy. The reason this maybe isn't higher on the list, even though it is pretty high, the end is nice and sweet and cathartic, but I didn't love it as much as I've loved other books in the series, or one particular other book in the series, which you can probably guess what it is by now. But yeah, Tough Guy was just really fantastic. It's the first time that we see Rachel Reed really excel in dealing with these deeper themes. Like, we've got more mental health rep in Game Changer, and the fact that Scott Hunter is so isolated as a queer man. And then in Heated Rivalry, it just is like Smut City with not a whole lot of other stuff going on. Particularly in the first half of that book, this is just like smut, and then we don't really get much of a development of the characters until later on. This is a lot more balanced. At this point in the series, Rachel Reed learned to like go easier on the smut. These 3 books are a lot less smut heavy than these 3 are, and I think it works for her. I think it works for her that she spent more of her energy developing the inner worlds of these 2 and their relationships with other people around them, and it just made for a much more successful reading experience with Tough Guy. And then, in what was a complete shock to me, the best book in the series, I think, is without a doubt, oh no, this one is unequivocally the best book in the series. It is pretty close between Role Model and Tough Guy, but as soon as I read Role Model, I knew that this was probably going to be the standout, once I realised that The Long Game wasn't really cutting it for me. This one is a big surprise to me because this focuses on one of the villains, I would say, of the NHL world. We are introduced to this hockey player, Troy Barrett. He doesn't really appear much in the other books. He's kind of tangentially there. The other characters mention him. He is best friends with this very, very hated hockey player called Dallas Kent. Through his association with Dallas and his kind of rampant homophobia on the ice to other players, we really go into this not liking Troy. Like, when I was reading Common Goal and it was setting up Role Model to be about Troy, when I'm reading like a romance series, I try not to read what the upcoming book is about and who it will focus on. I try to focus on the book I'm on there and then. And then when I finally get to that book, then I'll read the blurb and see who's going to be in it. And so when I was reading Common Goal, I was like, oh, she is setting this up to be about Troy Barrett. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I really don't like this character. He's been presented as such a villain throughout the whole thing. But she pulled off one hell of a redemption arc with Troy Barrett. This book was really, really effective in really turning around Troy's character, and we really see the most character growth, I would say, in any of the books in the series in Role Model with Troy. Troy is a closeted gay player. He aligns himself with these very toxically masculine players to kind of disguise from that. He's terrified of being outed. And so he aligns himself with these really unpleasant people as kind of like a camouflage. And it's also what he's been brought up to kind of accept because of his relationship with his dad, who's not a very good guy. But Troy's life kind of blows up at the beginning of Role Model. He and Dallas Kent have this massive falling out, which is the kind of where the tides start to turn. I'm not going to spoil what it is that causes Troy to turn against Dallas and very publicly have a falling out with him. But it is really, really explosive and I thought really well handled. It's a very delicate topic and I thought Rachel Reed did handle it very well. Troy gets traded to a much more poorly performing team in the NHL. He is really struggling at this time. Like, he's been in a secret relationship that has ended. So he's on a new team with no friends, no boyfriend. He's really struggling. He's very isolated and alone. And he ends up on the same team as Ilya, and these two have a great relationship and a really supportive kind of friendship develops between them throughout the course of the book, which was great. But also the love interest, Harris, is the social media manager for the team that Troy gets traded to, and this is like a proper kind of like Grump Sunshine situation where Harris is just like a really lovely all-round good dude who's really on great terms with everyone on this team, and he's really doing a lot for them in terms of their social media presence. And then you've got Troy, who is a grump, but he's so drawn to Harris Troy is our like grump character, but he's so drawn to Harris straight away because of Harris just radiating this like positivity and light, and Troy can recognize that he really needs some of that in his life, and then he starts to develop feelings for Harris. And I enjoyed the fact that in this one, the relationship unfolds quite naturally, and it's the one of the books in the series that doesn't really do like the conflict coming from within the relationship. The conflict is like coming from outside things. Like Troy is under a lot of pressure from higher ups in the NHL because of what's happened with Dallas Kent. He is struggling with his relationships with his father. He's struggling with how to potentially come out as a queer hockey player. He's struggling to build relationships with his new team, and those things all kind of form the conflict. There isn't like a big falling out between these two or any kind of like drama. Their relationship builds in a really natural and believable way, and there's like a really good amount of yearning. And you know I love yearning. You know I love it. You know I'm here for the yearning. The yearning between these two is great because Harris is just like this like normal dude, and he can't really quite believe that somebody as gorgeous as professional hockey player Troy Barrett could ever be attracted to him. And then Troy is like, I'm just this miserable dick. So this wonderful, joyful human being could never be attracted to me because I would just like bring him down with my negativity. And it's about Troy learning to like bring down these barriers, to rely on his team, to build relationships with his team. And yeah, the role model really surprised me. The real standout of the series, like the redemption arc in it is so good. Troy becomes someone that you absolutely root for so hard, and it is largely about this kind of dismantling of toxic masculinity and all of the harm that that does within hockey, but also in the wider impacts of the fans and things like that. And it's really about bringing down those walls and about learning to be a different kind of team. And I really enjoyed what Rachel Reed did with this one. I really didn't think I was going to be into it when I went into it and realised that it was about Troy. And she, completely exceeded my expectations with this one. So these two, Role Model and Tough Guy, absolutely my favourite standouts of the series. Role Model just edged it out slightly for me because I enjoyed what she was doing with the explorations of toxic masculinity in both of these, but she does it a bit more successfully, I think, in Role Model because she's focusing on a wider impact of this toxic masculinity, whereas in Tough Guy she's focusing on what that has done to kind of this one individual, and then Role Model builds on that to show you the impacts on the sport as a whole on a wider scale. Role Model for me, best one in the series. Complete surprise. Did not think she was going to do it, but she absolutely did. So there you have it. This is my definitive ranking of all of the books in the Game Changers series. I would still recommend that you read them all. I know some people just read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game because they love Shane and Ilya, but I think if you're missing out on these other books, these two especially, and the ending of Game Changer is just so good. And these two, they add so much extra depth, especially Role Model, because Role Model takes place on the same team that Ilya ends up on. You really get a great basis for the side characters and the setting from reading Role Model for The Long Game. I think The Long Game would have been less enjoyable for me if I hadn't read Role Model beforehand, because it really builds up those side characters, it builds up the dynamic of the team in the way that she neglects to do in The Long Game because she's already written Role Model. And a lot of the events that she touches on in The Long Game in particular, because you've already seen them happen in some of these other books, she doesn't develop them in the same way. And so I think if you were reading these two without having read the other books, you maybe would lose some of that emotional impact because they're explored better. Particularly like in Role Model, the things that happen in Role Model, some of them also happen in The Long Game, and you're seeing them from Ilya or Shane's perspective. And I think she pulls them off better in Role Model than she does in The Long Game. So I think you should just read them all. If you're going to read the series, read them all, read them in order. That's how I've done it, and I think that was the best reading experience for me. I think if I had just read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game, I probably wouldn't have wanted to go back and read these other ones, and that would have been a shame because I would have missed out on the two, what I think are arguably the two best books in the series. Those are all of my thoughts about the Game Changer series. For all of my nitpicking and my critiques of the books, I still had a great time with all of them. There wasn't a book in the series that I completely disliked. There were some that I found to be a bit disappointing because of the hype that they received and the fact that they weren't actually the best books in the series for me. Other ones were that I didn't really hear people talking about as much. But overall, I still had a really great time. I think there's just something so healing and comforting to read about a world where you have this group of people who are just fighting for change, and to see over the course of the whole series how things start to get better for queer people, for people with mental health problems, how the bonds between these characters build up and they start to make some real strides and make real progress within their sport. I think there's just something really healing about reading that happen, especially in the world we live in now, where it feels like a lot of things are rolling backwards and the progress has really stopped in a lot of ways. It's very heartwarming to read a series of books where the opposite is happening and things are moving forward. And that's not to say things aren't moving forward for some people in some parts of the world now, but you know, we are where we are in 2026, and things are perhaps not as we would have liked them to be, especially when it comes to the rights of queer people. So reading about a world where progress is happening and positive change is happening, it is very rewarding. These are obviously not the greatest works of literature ever made, but they are very moving at times. The characters in the middle books in the series, I would say, really did make a big impact on me, and I had a great time, and I'm really excited to dive into the show. It's about to make its debut in the UK. I've seen people posting about it for weeks now, and it's gonna be nice to finally be a part of the viewing experience of Heated Rivalry, and I've thoroughly enjoyed making my way through the book series. I would consider reading other books by Rachel Reed in future. If you haven't read the Game Changers books, but you're into queer romance, I think you definitely would have a good time with reading them. Ultimately, this has been a really fun, rewarding reading experience for me. So if you haven't read the Game Changers books, I'd recommend it. If you've only read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game, stop doing that and read these other ones, because these are also very good. Arguably better, I would say, than Heated Rivalry and The Long Game. So yeah, definitely stop sleeping on these other books in the series if you are someone who's only read Heated Rivalry or only read Heated Rivalry and The Long Game. There's so much more to this world than Shane and Ilya, even though I love Shane and Ilya. Ilya in particular, I do feel like Shane is done a bit dirty in like The Long Game. He like barely gets a look in compared to Ilya. So I'm excited to see what the actors bring to these characters now that I have formed an idea of them in my head, and to see how that is translated onto screen. If you have read the Game Changer series, what did you think of my ranking? Did you agree or disagree with any of my... I feel like a lot of people are going to disagree with where I put Heated Rivalry in The Long Game, and I get it. I get it that people are very attached to those two books and those two characters, so I completely get it, and I'm happy to discuss any disagreements you have with me in the comments about where I have placed my rankings. That's it from me for today. I could talk about these books for hours. I have lots of thoughts and opinions, but I'm going to leave it there. Leave me a like if you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it. Subscribe if you want to see more content from me in the future, and until then, stay safe and happy reading.